I just clicked the link. So
Okay.
this is what you get to see.
Oh, yes.
So maybe all of this has been missed.
No, no.
Probably.
Okay, going live. Okay, I'm getting a warning. Everyone stop talking, please. Okay.
We are live now.
Yeah.
Jackie, you're on mute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Pingal, we were just talking on,
Right.
on your base opinion, right?
To pick up from where we stopped, this measure, these guidelines seem to be of a temporary nature. At least if you look at the context and the language, it seems to suggest these are COVID-19 measures. Now, there are 2-3 issues with it. First is these seem to be Labor and Employment Ministry guidelines and not Health Ministry guidelines. So, of course, it is, I'm sure, informed by Health Ministry's instructions, because Labor and Employment Ministry may not be competent to speak about this issue. But the way this has been done is to make it look like a framework of rules to be applied within the organization, workplaces. We must first make it very clear that these are not by the nature of a law. So technically, no employer really needs to follow them. Having said that, that is not how it works practically, and most large corporates will tend to follow them. And that is not how it works practically, even from a policing perspective. Like the Prime Minister gave a speech saying everybody should wear a mask. From the next evening, police started catching people not wearing masks and taking it more seriously on the streets of Bangalore. So therefore, this will end up having an effect of a law on ground, but it will not have to go through the test that a law has to pass. I'm not going to get in right now in opening remarks about the right or wrong of doing this, but my concern would be whether they stay temporary or not, and how much are these guidelines infringing upon personal liberty, and how do we balance personal liberty as against social responsibility? I think that's the question that becomes moot from a legal perspective.
Right. Of course, I completely agree with you that guidelines issued on safe work practices are relevant during these COVID times. But what do you think the reason for such a recommendation by the Ministry of Health given to the Ministry of or Employment, ESI and so on and so forth? Kiran, could you give us some kind of insight onto that one?
Sure. Actually, if you look at it, these guidelines are a framework prepared by the ESIC, that is the Employee State Insurance Corporation of India. So they have prepared these frameworks, and that has been sort of sent across by the ministry. If you look at the framework, if you look at the guidelines, it links on to the guidelines issued already by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So in this, there are a few points that I think we need to get out of the way. Vivek and Suniti, there is no mention that this has been done for people to quit smoking. What they have mentioned, the reason for this guideline is people taking cigarette breaks are supposed to be social distancing disruptors. That is the reasoning for giving this. So what, I mean, if you look at it from a normal perspective, that's usually what happens. People go in a group, they go out, have a smoke, have a cup of tea or something like that, and they usually chat or brainstorm or whatever it is they do. So it is right, people do go out in groups, but then they go out in groups to have coffee, they go out in groups to have food, to have a water break, to have, I mean, even if they're non-smokers, they do go out in groups. The guidelines have been, I mean, if you look at the guidelines, they're excellent guidelines. They have tried to cover everything. And most of it is just plain common sense. I mean, it's been almost, I mean, it's going to be close to a year since we have had the pandemic. So by now, all this is common knowledge. So it sets it out in black and white so that the companies have a pathway to follow for safe work practices. But while they have established specific guidelines for food, for water, wherein they say you bring it to your desk, you have it at your desk, stop the cafeterias or try to have it in an open area. So they've had very good guidelines for all this. But then they have not really thought about what the smoker is going to do. Or if somebody is having some sort of nicotine dependence, what is he going to do? You can't switch it on or off. It is a dependence, right? Unfortunately, that is where these guidelines fall short. So they have taken everybody else into account, but not the smokers.
Thank you. I want to ask Vivek and Suniti, even Pingal, what are the current practices that you have in your offices about breaks, and specifically smoke breaks as they are called? Do you have any specific practices that you have, guidelines or things like that as of now?
Sure. So I before replying to the question, in fact, very interesting point brought out by Dr. Kiran. The only difference is that these guidelines are not a new guideline. Okay, they might have come at the time of COVID, but we see on almost 80% of tobacco products some guidelines, some notification from the government. Okay, tobacco is bad for health, or with the picture, etc. Okay, so the notifications, guidelines are already there, omnipresent. The only thing is, at this time, it is being implemented in the offices, and so this debate. Yeah. Now, the perspective here is that guidelines should be implemented, whether it's smoking break or no smoking break. If a person has an urge to smoke, he would go out or she would go out and smoke. Okay. And I completely agree that these are not guidelines for quitting smoking. However, all these are only helping the government in advising the individuals about how can it impact the individual adversely in their fight to COVID.
I agree with you there. See, Vivek, I agree with you there. But if you look at it from a perspective of with the recent phase 5 of opening up business establishments and things like that, I mean, bars have been opened, right? Nightclubs are open today, and you're talking of a social distancing disruptor in the form of a smoking at a workplace, and you're permitting a bar and a nightclub establishment to operate. There seems to be a gap there. While I completely agree that these are advisories that should be taken on account and taken into record and so on, we have all spent enough time, like Kiran was mentioning, being absorbed and coming to a realization as to what our do's and don'ts are. And there are things that we should follow and so on. So these are reinforcers, completely concede. But isn't the government really overstepping here by talking about it specific to workplaces and smoking in that manner? You know?
Jaggi, I'd like to make 2 points here. First, I completely disagree with Mr. Sagar's perspective on this issue when it comes to the fact that this is some kind of a continuation of a policy. As a lawyer, when I look at this document, this has nothing to do with smoking. This is not a tobacco document. This has nothing to do with tobacco at all. It actually spends about 1/100th of the entire print space on tobacco. This is a problem I completely agree that the government is completely within its rights to tell us how we should operate if we have to open businesses in the midst of a pandemic, right? So we must first understand that this has to be temporary. This has to be something where we are ceding our private spaces to a government. We are ceding our private rights to a government only for the purposes of managing an extraordinary situation and not giving it away perpetually. This is fundamental, and we need to understand this. We should stop making this about tobacco, and we should understand that this is really about COVID. Now, the second element is, and we should make sure that the government is clear that this is only and only about COVID. The second element here is that, is the government overstepping? The first prima facie answer is no. A government of a country has a right to act as a parent on issues of public health. It has a preemptory right to prevent harm. Now, one of the beliefs is the social distancing disruptor. The other is cigarette smoking does involve a significant amount of exhalation. And that itself, and because most people do it at least as two people, unlike a water cooler conversation where the two people could be wearing a mask, you're not going to be wearing a mask while smoking, right? You cannot chat. You don't need to take off your mask to chat, but you need to take off your smoke. Therefore, that's a fundamental part that is there. But where this concerns me, and it doesn't concern me purely from a tobacco perspective, because smoking has technically been banned in workplaces for several years now. In a designated smoking area, people have gone there and smoked, except in chartered accountants and advocates' offices, where you can smoke wherever you want, because those are not considered offices. They're extended Class A profession. You can smoke on the public road. But the issue is that, look, somewhere down the line, today, I have only one doubt in my head. How do you expect an employer to implement this? The only thing that an employer can do, and let's take any STPI in Bangalore as an example. In an entire STPI, there will be one large smoking area. In the entire STPI, it will have 16 to 20 buildings with about 100 offices, one large smoking area. And people go and smoke there. What you can do now is ban that. You can close that down temporarily, which will then mean what? Will the person who is dependent on smoking stop smoking, or will he then walk out of the place and go and smoke?
Right.
The chances are he will do the latter. So what you have done is then you have now brought this trouble, the menace to the public place, out there on the road. You can say, but smoking is anywhere allowed on the road. But in the extraordinary circumstances, it's not supposed to be. Second, then when you've done that, aren't you actually losing work hours? Or are you saying that if you are a smoker, you cannot work? Because that's what you're effectively doing. You know, here is a person who has a medical dependency, literally. He is a clinical dependency on this substance, nicotine. You're telling him, you're not telling him how to do it. You're not telling him that, okay, there will be a designated smoking area. You have to stand in a queue and only one person can be there at a time, and that it has to be sanitized every 10 minutes or whatever. You're instead saying he can't do it. Don't let him do it. Now, when you're saying that, you're essentially saying that I am going to make your ability to work in a workplace in India impossible. I'm going to essentially make you jobless, or you got to quit. And that is where the government oversteps. The government tramples over right to livelihood, takes away dignity, and infantilizes its citizens, which is a problem because you let it happen now, it goes without a protest, and it will, because it's extraordinary circumstances. The chances are when the extraordinary circumstances go away, the government doesn't go back. I'll give you one example. I'll take 1 minute. It's a very controversial topic. Essential Commodities Act first came in when we used to be a food deficit country, first came in during wars. Later on, it became the law which literally gave birth to the license Raj. Wars came, wars went away. This continued. Another example, a defunct, terrible law created by colonialists to take care of the Spanish flu pandemic, which is the law that has been used this time to control us. So once a bad law or a bad practice, an encroachment on citizens' rights is allowed, very rarely in history has a government ever rolled that back. Because governments like overreaching. The job of the law and the citizens is to fight that back. And that's my concern.
No, it's the other point that also comes into play, and maybe Suniti, you could help me out on this one is, see, here is the thing that we are actually, now the government is asking us to put restrictions on our employees as to what they can and cannot do during a break. And like Pingal said, it's an infringement of personal liberty almost. And would not an employee therefore be within his right to take us to court saying that you have, hampering and stepping into my personal liberty, and what I do in my personal break is my business? Would you be worried about something like that? I think we have lost. Okay, Suniti, Vivek, maybe you could help me out with that one.
So I heard Pingal, and he has advocated it as good as a lawyer can do. I mean, from his perspective, he's doing justice to the subject. But when I look at it from the citizen's perspective, I find it. See, the government is not doing it for making people jobless. I mean, it's nothing. The government is not doing it because they want to increase work hours, or they want to create a menace on the street. I mean, the government is doing it because people have to increase their immunity, and it is only the immunity that fights COVID. And that's why this regulation has come now. I mean, we don't know once post-COVID, maybe a year down the line, what will the situation of regulation on masks, on social distancing, on smoking ban, etc. So I believe anything that increases immunity and the government suggests through their notification should be supported.
No, Samrat's been in media and involved in journalism his entire life. Samrat, what would be your observations to what Vivek said? Have you seen not just this government, but government by and large, do they actually roll back certain decisions that they have taken in your journalistic career? Have you come across something like this? Pingal says they've never done that.
I'll tend to agree with Pingal here, because once ideas and laws start becoming formalized, it is rare that you have a step back. I don't know if any of you have heard of any law being repealed. I mean, it is something that we never come across. That being said, on this particular issue, I want to say a couple of things. One is I do agree with Vivek that it is well-intentioned. I think it may not be fair to question the government's good intentions in doing this. What I find a little issue with is the way they have gone about it, or whether it's a good measure in the first place, or whether the measure should have been thought through. Because for the points that Kiran and Pingal have mentioned, will it? The question is, will it stop the spread of COVID? When bars are open, when it's not like they're banning any breaks in office. They're not saying that all employees at work cannot take a break. They're saying only if you're smoking, then you can't take a smoking break. So, aren't all those other activities social distancing disruptors? So I think, and therefore, there is a suspicion that this is more a moralistic move, where the government, of course, well-intentionedly or with the right intentions, wants smokers to quit, but perhaps the way of going about it through enforcement and prohibition, which we know are not great motivators to get people to quit. Instead, if it was really the right intention to get smokers to quit, there's a lot of other things that could be done. One could be that the smoking rooms, there could be guidelines around smoking rooms. Now, if you as Dr. Kiran pointed out, the advisory itself is quite detailed about other activities. It talks about, how you can, how social distancing can be maintained, how a sanitized environment can be maintained, and it gets into specifics about those. But when it comes to smoking, it is just the prohibition that they want to bring in, which I think is not being helpful. So, for example, there could be guidelines around smoking rooms, how they have to be maintained, whether a certain, whether they could restrict the number of people that can use it at one time, or as Pingal mentioned, these smoking rooms could be moved to open areas so that there is social distancing. There could be cessation support that could be provided by corporates to their smoking population. Because what happens in the absence of that is that I fear that there may be workplace discrimination being created. You may be creating two classes of employees, one who smoke and one who don't smoke, and one is treated differently and the other is treated differently. It could also encourage more risky behavior, because when you're telling them you can't take smoking breaks, but you can take other breaks, there may be some employees who will make excuses and go further down onto the streets where they may be more exposed to contracting, or it's a more risky behavior, and which also impacts people in the office when they come back. So while the intent may be right, I think it should have been thought through a little more carefully. And also see the onus now of implementing this is on corporates. Are we sure that they have the wherewithal to enforce something like this? And are they creating acrimony between their employees by trying to enforce something like this? So all these need to be given a thought before something like this is brought in.
Jaggi, I just clarify one thing. So it is not what the government's intention is. When I said that effectively this is what the government is doing,
Right.
We all need to understand that the law does not care about intention unless it's about criminal acts.
Okay.
So every other law doesn't give two hoots about intention.
Okay.
Is there a scope for arbitrariness? Can an employer misuse this? Can an employee misuse this? And the latter is going to happen. As in, how will you as an employer stop an employee from taking breaks? And the employee is an adult. He will take a break and do what he wants to do in that break. So then you have to say, well, I will not give you any break. And if you do that, it will be criminal. So therefore, this is not well thought out. And the reason why it's not well thought out is because the intent here is not tobacco control. The intent here was only dealing with a set of guidelines for COVID-19, where a certain moralistic element came in. Had this actually been well thought out, then they would have given guidelines for smoking areas. They would have insisted on queues. They would have said a smoking area must be of a certain size and only X number of people can be inside it at any one point of time. Because those are kind of things that a corporate could have put in a couple of security guards and ensured that those are being enforced. But now these guidelines are the classic case of the government taking a high horse, giving a guideline, knowing full well nobody will be able to enforce half of it, but can say, hey, I did all I could. This is the problem. This, again, just like the prohibition of ENDS, is one of those easy policy routes where you make a policy that somehow shifts the responsibility from you to someone else. And someone who technically doesn't even have the authority to enforce it, can't actually enforce it. If I want to go out and have a smoke, my boss tries to physically stop me, I have a full-fledged assault case against him. That poor guy will be rotting in jail. So this is the problem of activists advising government.
Right.
They actually have an idea for that.
On this one, I just would like to say one of our viewers have actually written in, Mohammad Adnan has written in saying restrictions such as these are just not fair, period. If they really cared about public health, then they should curb the sale of tobacco and alcohol. Now, Adnan, while I agree with the first half of your statement, I'd like to say that curbing of tobacco and alcohol is not the prerogative or not the scope of this particular directive. Kiran, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to talk about how, I mean, they actually looked into the part about these companies implementing also, just to answer you. So this is basically, they have said, put CCTV cameras everywhere. Okay? Monitor your employees closely. If you find them violating, it should go in their annual appraisals. It's there in the guideline. You just have a look.
Correct.
Yeah. So this is what they're saying. So they will not restrain you physically, but it will show up in your paycheck later on.
Correct.
See,
Here is the
I have a
problem.
question. I have a question to Pingal. Apparently, you said this is a guideline not coming from the government, but coming from ESIC.
No, I said it's coming from the Ministry of Labor and not from the Ministry of Health.
No, actually, I said ESIC. I said ESIC.
Okay.
It's been prepared by ESIC. It has been prepared by ESIC and it has been brought forward by the government.
Because
So
this comes under,
is there some
yeah.
data which is backed, which is backing this notification or guideline from government or ESIC, which says that the immunity of people gets reduced when they smoke, and during COVID, it would be helpful that they don't smoke so frequently so that their immunity can remain better.
Unfortunately, that was the general thought. But there are studies, in fact, which have shown the opposite. Of course, that is the problem. You do enough studies, you can prove anything. It's as simple as that. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But at the same time, there is no clear link found between smoking and chances of COVID. But if you have been a heavy smoker and you have damaged your lungs beyond repair, then of course you're at a higher risk for anything, not just COVID. But if you're an office worker,
can't the government implement it? If ESIC tomorrow say that if you are a smoker, I would not help you get the ESIC claim. So I mean the government would be post notification well within their rights to expand.
That is a wholly different issue. That is a wholly different issue. See, if they wanted to control tobacco, they should say they want to control tobacco. Intentions, like I totally agree with Pingal, intentions don't count for anything. Now, I am only going by what they have written in the guidelines. They are saying it is a social distancing disruptor. I am taking it at face value. That's what we have to. It's written there. It's clearly written there.
Yeah, I would not like to read between the lines a little too much on that one.
I can't read minds. I can't read minds.
Correct. I have one thing to say. I would really want to see ESIC do that. I really want to see ESIC do that. It would be great fun. It would be a hell of a day in court. And some ESIC heads will roll at the end of it because it will be an incredibly dumb.
I disagree. I mean, if ESIC wants to do, they can do.
No, they can't do. They can't do. If they want to do, they will be dead in the water. Because ESIC is a statutory body. ESIC is a statutory body. What you're saying is wrong. It's wrong in law at a prima facie level. If they
just hear me out.
They'll be dead in the water. They're not a private insurance company.
No, Pingal, there are examples of insurance companies coming out in public and saying
yes,
that if you smoke, we will increase your premium.
ESIC cannot do that because ESIC is a statutory body.
It's a statutory body.
To ESIC is a statutory obligation under the law. ESIC is not LIC, which is also a statutory body but acts as a corporation. ESIC actually cannot do that because it's a statutory obligation to pay ESIC.
You might be knowing the law better than me.
It's a public authority. It does that. The entire ESIC body will come under scrutiny. It cannot do that. It will be dead in the water. You can't do that. ESIC is a compensation. I will say I will not let my ESIC get deducted. If ESIC can't insure me, I'll say I will not let my ESIC get deducted. But the statute does not give me the scope. So there you go. Now, what is compulsory cannot have a condition.
Correct.
This is the biggest difference between any insurance company and ESIC. So ESIC can't do that. They just can't because that would be a humongous violation of Article 21 of the Constitution. ESIC will be shot.
Article 21 cannot come for everything saving.
Suniti, I can see Suniti
smile. It's the most fallacious legal concept I've heard in my life, in fairness.
I have a question to Pingal. I just wanted to understand, since it is SIC, what exactly their perspective? Are they looking for the industrial setup rather than the normal offices? Basically,
Industrial and establishments.
industrial-
ESIC covers industries and establishments,
All,
Right.
everything.
all of them. So
It covers everything, all commercial establishments.
all commercial establishments who employ 8 people or more.
Correct.
That's the law of the land.
Yeah,
Anyway,
but see, if I would
yeah.
like to add something here. The way the government has been trying to implement tobacco policy, they have been trying to draw other arms of the government into doing things which they normally have not. For example, this carrying of electronic cigarettes, even though personal consumption is not banned, banning it on flights, even though the law does not allow for banning of personal consumption, is in a way using the aviation ministry to that goal. Right. So, and then there was a ban on research, which was using the universities commission and to further that goal. So it is not new to use, but
the National Board of Exams. National Board of Exams.
Yeah. So, but the problem is here, private enterprises, offices are being roped into a no tobacco mission, which see, as I said, and this need not be repeated because the intention may not be wrong, but how do you first expect corporates to implement something like this? The enforceability of a guideline has also to be enforceable. If I say no, tomorrow everyone should fly to work, how are you going to make that happen? So while a guideline, the government can come up with any guidelines, they also have to be practical in that sense and also humane. Because are we looking at, so if someone is smoking, let's say 10 or 20 cigarettes a day, and for his 10 hours at work, you're telling him, now you cannot. Are you reasonably expecting that person's productivity not to fall? And how is that person going to cope? And what support is the office going to provide? So while the officer said you can't, but where is the humanity in that? What kind of support is that smoker being provided to tide over those 10 hours?
I have another question.
That is, I feel that the humaneness of that.
To Samrat's point, there's a very interesting thing that I thought maybe we should, if a recommendation as to government we can go for, is there are de-addiction centers. Okay. I run a mental health company which has a huge flow from for requesting for de-addiction. Okay, can the government CSR funds, can the company CSR funds go in getting their employees de-addicted? If this is one possibility,
that is a proactive move. That is a very proactive decision.
Exactly.
A thing that the government. So something like that is most welcome, because then you are providing smokers support and not just a ban. See, prohibitory measures can only go that far and may also have negative consequences. Now, we are not seeing this only just for tobacco, but it is just for every single dependence or addiction, you have the same problems, right? So much so that for drug users, there are more humane policies today than there are for tobacco users. You are not going to go and tell a heroin-dependent person, "Nahi, aap chhod do," and that's it. No one realistically expects to do that, right? But with tobacco users, even though it is a strong dependence, there is some sort of a belief that if you tell them, if we ban it, then it will work. It will not work. What will happen?
De-addiction is a 3 months, 6 months process. It's not an easy thing.
Sure.
It's not a click of a thought.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. That is what I'm saying. That is a proactive decision, because you're recognizing that this is an issue which needs to be handled medically, and counseling, behavior and medical support is to be provided. That is a proactive decision, right? Where you are encouraging corporates to do something like that. But that is not what we are discussing now. What we are discussing is a de facto, a sort of an advisory to corporates to simply ban this.
Samrat, I have no confusion. So if these guidelines are not law, right? So tomorrow, let us say my employer decides to deduct my salary at the end of the year, right? Now he has to basically then retain each one of those CCTV evidence of me violating it. He has to then defend that this was actually part of his policy. I can then say that this was getting into my private space because I was smoking outside the premises of the office. Now, do you realize the amount of problem this puts the poor private enterprise in? I mean, the private enterprise is literally walking into a minefield of litigation. And know, in India, it doesn't matter whether you will win the litigation or lose the litigation. You just don't want to get involved in the litigation because.
No, I agree. I agree with you because I run an industry, and Vikas and Suniti too. And the one thing that this opens up is to red tapeism with harassment and inspections. We already have so many inspections by so many departments. So are you complying with this advisory is going to become an inspection. Now, how are you going to enforce these kinds of guidelines? Are they really enforceable? Actually does come into question. But, going a little further, if you touch upon what Kiran and Samrat were talking about, now this particular guideline haven't spoken anything about what that smoker is going to do when it comes to withdrawals. And what is he going to face if he or she is denied their nicotine fix? They will struggle and they cope. And what are the provisions that are going to be available to an organization to mitigate something like this? And aren't we actually opening up a Pandora's box for potential risky behavior to get their fix? This is something that actually can have disastrous consequences, isn't it? Kiran, what is your opinion on this one?
First, I have a question. Now,
Yeah.
Is this advisory or is this just guidelines? As in, do we have to follow it?
Technically, it's a mixed bag in the sense that no one has said that if you look at the language, it has not said like the previous guidelines that you can open a bar if you are going to have these rules. This doesn't go like that. This is more of a request that you can run it this way.
So that's what I thought.
You can walk away.
Exactly. So that's what I thought, because in fact, I had that same question, which you so nicely answered. Basically, that if an employee sues the employer, can the employer claim he was following these guidelines? But then the court will say it was just guidelines. Why did you follow it?
No, the employer can claim. Absolutely. But the problem is, the larger issue is smaller organizations don't even want to have litigation.
No, but finally, who will be liable?
Organizations neither. Yeah. So whoever finally wins in court is really not the point. I actually agree that most likely because of the time when this has been brought out, what Mr. Sagar, what Vivek says is what's going to happen. I mean, the employers will possibly even win in court. But the problem is that will happen 5 years from the time the litigation starts. And no employer, no employee, nobody wants this. So, and the other issue, my other concern, and this is happening again and again with not just this government, every government that has come before it, is that we are refusing to accept that addiction is a disease. I mean,
completely agree with you. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, we're just refusing to see that. I mean, if we can't see that, if we can't treat these people as a people with a problem that need to get some kind of a redressal, then obviously we will end up having laws which are walking all over the Constitution, and that will keep on happening.
So, Pingal, you rightly said, see, this is the right word for this is not a disease, it's a mental health issue. Any smoking, or for that matter, any addiction is a mental health issue. Okay, it could be internet addiction also. It is a mental health issue. Okay, and it has to be followed through a de-addiction process. Okay, it has to be done under the guidelines of experts. Yeah. The government should, in my opinion, not only put these guidelines, but should also recommend corporates to start with de-addiction centers in case if they really want to go ahead in this direction. Not force it by saying don't ban smoking, but start with the CSR activities for de-addiction. Maybe not only for employees, for their family members, because smoking it's a trigger. When you see someone is smoking, you get the trigger.
Absolutely.
Okay. And not only for employees, I mean, for their mates, for their servants, it can be a whole society that can get benefited if CSR and de-addiction comes in.
But this has to be voluntary. It has to be voluntary.
Absolutely. I completely agree with
Absolutely.
Yeah. It cannot be implemented through guidelines. It has
Suniti,
to be
what would be your take on this one?
Exactly. I'm just following what exactly Pingal is saying. That's completely okay that government is saying you do this or you should do this, you should not do this. That's fine. I'm okay with this. The only thing, suppose in my organization, being a non-smoker myself, I have a team who a lot of people smokes, and they are almost like habitual smoker, and then they are doing good. They whatever they are doing in their break, but at the end of the day, their productivity is good. I am happy, they are happy, and they are also following the health norms. They are maintaining the social distancing as much as possible, and they are doing it. So my question is that why the government is pushing our thoughts or pushing our lives in a different direction that I do not want to move. No, it's about my will. I'm an educated person. Living in a democratic country. So give me that liberty what I am enjoying. I love this country as I want to be. Don't give me that's my thing. How suppose one or two members of my team, they would like to smoke and then to walk, okay, and they are very much efficient on doing that. That's how they do. So if I stop them, then my fear is that their productivity will also hit. So how I can tackle that in that manner if I follow those kind of see, now you are saying that I have to also answerable to the government systems that I have to deduct their salary. So this is my question. It's a completely U-turn, taking a U-turn on myself as a leader of the organization. So that's where I am little bit annoyed. I'm not happy into the thing. My thought is that.
So Samrat, the
Kiran,
government has taken its mace and put it on the hands of the private business leaders and made it their
Yeah. See, I would take up from what Vivek said, and let's talk about what solutions everyone thinks. Okay, I think there is general consensus that de facto ban, and that too asking private companies to implement it on behalf of the government and penalize their employees. Maybe that's not the correct way. I think there is some consensus here on that. But then, what can the government do? And I have listed a few things. I think tobacco cessation, first of all, should be seen not as tobacco use is not a choice. I think first of all, there should be recognition that people are not waking up in the morning and make a decision whether or not to smoke. They are dependent on smoking, and it should be seen in that from the lens of addiction. I think that is important, and that recognition itself, can help shift the narrative a bit. Because if there was understanding that this is dependence, these people are dependent on smoking or other nicotine and tobacco products, then the idea of just banning it and then expecting to get results from that may not even have come forth. So once there is recognition, and I see, I don't think I stand for smokers' rights. That is not correct. I don't think anyone stands for smokers' rights as such. Because if you are doing something which is harmful to you and to people around you, you should be encouraged in whichever ways possible to move out of that habit or to reduce harm to yourself and to people around you. So there is no debate in my mind whether smokers should quit. Yes, they should. How do we achieve that in a way that is both humane and practical and effective? So if that recognition was there, I quite like Vivek's idea that corporates could do more to participate in tobacco cessation, voluntarily, of course, but nudging and encouraging their employees. Uh, it's I don't know if corporates really are meant to make a individual's personal life better, because if you start going down that road tomorrow, they want to make you want you to have less sugary drinks and watch less TV and don't spend time on it. I don't know whether it's even a mandate for a corporate to go into that direction, but even so, and even if this was taken up as a national initiative, it should be voluntary. But are corporates willing to spend money and resources into helping their employees quit? That's the next question. So A ban is a very simple solution, and I don't think it works. But let's look at things that do work. Completely in the respect of COVID, I said, you could look at smoking room guidelines that should have come forth. You could look at moving smoking rooms to open areas, which could also help reduce risk. You could encourage smokers to quit and provide some sort of cessation support, be it through subsidized NRTs, which the office can subsidize, or access to de-addiction centers, or to do a course there. They could make it part of their CSR activity. They could contribute in some way to developing a program for employees like that. And those things I think would be more useful than something like that. Something like a ban, which is difficult to implement and also jeopardizes, a lot of other things discussed.
A lot of the discussion today would have been not required if the government had done what it normally does with these kind of guidelines, which is it should have said that the corporates and employers are encouraged to come up with innovative programs to incentivize not smoking during this COVID time at workplaces.
That would have been perfect.
Yes, because then the instinctive backlash of saying how can you prohibit doesn't come up. It doesn't burden the employer with methods of trying to enforce something, because look, companies are not police departments. They're not good at enforcement. That's not their job. So you're putting them, like Mr. Suniti said, you're putting them in a very tough spot. The leader of the business, you're asking him to go and tell a very efficient employee, don't do this. I will have to deduct your salary. It does not work for the leader. So that would have been perfect. And yes, in the long run, no doubt, I think proper de-addiction programs has to be the way to go. Look, already today, most companies have this whole mental health element, right? Where they talk about if you've gone through a traumatic situation, you need to go take counseling, if you're willing, of course, and for a few days, and the company will have a counselor on rolls to provide that. So those kind of things at least can be looked at. Some companies could have it as on the roll, some could have a tie-up, like MSMEs could have a tie-up, but that would be a great way forward. In the long run, short run, I think government shouldn't have walked into telling us that, we should have put CCTVs and all of that. That's my main concern, that, this tendency to encroach, and this is not just in India, COVID-19 pandemic has been used world over to take away personal liberties, and those aren't coming back.
Kiran, what would be your observations or your advice on what we have in front of us right now?
Actually, all of these guidelines are quite good. So, except for the smoking part, of course, because I think that is very arbitrary and ill thought out. But the rest of the guidelines are excellent. And to be very frank, even though we know most of these things, if you just have to look around you in the cities, you just have to look around you what's happening. People just go everywhere, they touch their faces, the masks are below their noses. Some people have it on their throats. So it's not like they don't know, but it's ridiculous. So if we have these guidelines, at least these parts of it are enforced in the office, that would go a long way. I mean, I work in a hospital where we have COVID patients, and we have people crowding the lifts. We have to tell them only, there are spots which are drawn on the floor of the lift. You have to stand in those facing at the wall. Nobody follows it. We try to tell them 2 people per lift or 4 people per lift, which is a larger one, but everybody starts rushing in. So what happens ultimately, we as doctors, we step out. We let them, because they seem to be in a much greater hurry than us. But this is what we see everywhere. People have forgotten the fear of the pandemic. For some reason, the fear factor has gone away, and that is not a good thing. We are still at risk. It is a very dangerous situation. There are a lot of people at home who are at risk, who are not stepping out. So I think we need to, treat this with the proper caution, and any guideline which tries to help us to do this is very welcome. But we have to address the concerns of all sections, all kinds of workers. And like we already heard, some smokers are also, a few of the best workers are also smokers. You can't help it, but that's how it happens. Yes, so you should try to address all of these concerns. In fact, just a few days back, I was listening to one of the BBC podcast, and there was a guy from Sweden. He was the head of the head of the public health he was the head of the public health authority there. I think his name is Johan Carlson. So Sweden had the most lax controls. They had the most lax lockdowns, and they had a 7-day quarantine. They still have a 7-day quarantine, not 14 days. Now, they were also hit badly. Their economy also contracted, but they kept their schools open. So they're saying that you have not seen the effects of those things, what all the other countries are facing now. You will see that it will do us good in the long run. But in any case, this guy came on radio and he said, this is the reason we didn't do it. These steps are going to be in place for a very long time. You should make it easy to follow. If you have a speed limit of 50 and if everybody is driving at 60, you don't bring it down to 20. You try to bring it down to 40 first. This is the exact analogy he gave us. But I think that makes a lot of sense.
I agree. And I guess in conclusion, what I guess we could all agree upon is the devil really is in the detail. While the government can have very, very good intentions, and most of it is what we all really do require, there are certain bits and pieces of it that stick out as sore thumbs and irritants, and are things that actually are counterproductive and actually defeat the purpose behind which they had thought of putting together such a thing. Maybe it's in the wording, maybe it is that, but it definitely calls for the government to relook at this and find a way to address it to the intention that they really want to do, rather than put out something like this of this nature. Yeah. With that, I would like to wrap up today's Funvocacy, and I'd really like to thank Vivek for taking time, Sunil, Suniti, thank you so much. Pingal,
Thank you.
Wonderful as always. And Kiran, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Samrat,
much. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.